Hi, welcome. And I'd like to welcome. My name is Stephen Sheehi. I'm the Mary Cornell Professor of the Humanities at Wellesley College this year, but I'm also the Sultan Qaboos Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at William and Mary and the Director of the Decolonizing Humanities Project. I am very happy today to introduce my dear friend and incredible poet, Azad Ashim Sharma. Before I give you a quick bio, I just want to recognize that I am beaming in from the occupied land of the Pamunkey Confederacy. Pamunkey Confederacy includes the Pamunkey people, the Kisyak, the Cherahanaka and Nottoway peoples, the Chickahominy and Eastern Chickahominy peoples, the Manakan and the Nansemond and the Patawomic peoples, as well as the Mattaponi and Upper Mattaponi and Rappahannock peoples, who are all the indigenous people of the settler colony state now known as Virginia. And it's incredibly important for me to recognize this because we are all cognizant of how we participate in systems of oppression, racial and settler colonial as well, including what is happening in Palestine, Kashmir, occupied Cyprus, and the Western Sahara. So I think you hear those elements of politics and reality and history coming out in Azad's work, who he himself is beaming in from the Imperial Centre of London. Azad is a dear friend. I'm not going to belabor a very accomplished resume on him, but he is based in South London. He is the director of an incredible press, the 87 Press. And Azad, if you have a link, you can post that in the chat, or I can do it when you're talking. I should have been prepared. Sorry. The 87 Press is a really powerful independent press in London, and Azad also has a lot to say about independent publishing. He's the author of Against the Frame with Bark Press in 2017, and actually two forthcoming books of poetry and prose poetry, which we will be hearing excerpts from them today. That is Boiled Owls with Nightboat Books, and also Ergastelum with Broken Sleep Press in forthcoming year in 2020. So I'd like to thank you, Azad, for showing up with me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a really, really great privilege to be part of 1455 Literature Festival. Yeah, I'm beaming in from the Imperial Centre. So I'm going to start with a section from the book that Stephen just mentioned called Ergastelum, Vignettes of Lost Time, which is forthcoming on Broken Sleep Books in 2022. This is from a section called Stepping to the Left of Ontology. The yogi asks me to get back to my breathing. It is illegal to not obey metaphysics, our search for de-ontologized futures, against our knowledge that we've been locked in the death of time, its scentless performances of accelerated information and whiz-banged task management. We sought out the minor doors towards the horizon where we could become changelings. Reduction to loam, we could be protogrammatologues I see you, deferring and differing the shake of the task in the trace of misery beams. Suddenly to be cockneyed, a chicken by bow type of situation eggs the question on basic demands, four bare necessities: live, laugh, love, let go. We all tried humor, doing the Einaudi on a makeshift ice shelf. Existenz is paused. To be free in the ruin or to hold the Popol Vuh, following the guidance to re-allegorize the allegory. Held close in the water, saying flowed between repulsions of skin, which we were feeling as a quantum moment of contact, just to be unthinkable and thinking. We address the constraints, trying to reckon with the raket in Recht philosophy, the waves of acid in an ocean of mitochondria, or druids from our inner polis. We were trying to hold each other outside of time. Far off shall we go to decolonize normative living with antifreeze on my armpit hair and an oven glove on my left hand when it speaks in ink. It is never done, but stays in the saying. To write poetry is to move into the air, resist nihilism's endgame of deracination, and to address you in poetry with and as endless spelling errors, abreactive code for dissent, melismatic ostinato of mantric wove. We syncopate together in what subtends as a quotidian readily poetics. We take notes when words make worlds for us, and we moved in concrescence. Somewhere over the hill, it was so easy. Then the red tape was placed over our thumbs, and we acknowledged a mutual respect for books, the pages of which we were rendered unable to turn, our mouths taped over with red as we tried to utter the unutterable protest against the anti-protest receipts. Of tongues, macaronic, before we sought flexion in, such ebullient fractal interiors weren't ever fulliness. To remain curious is to be provoked in the best way. Through all this maelstrom of death, of thought, is another ology, sah, the state of apology, and we were chained in and by it, a gastulum, to speak of and at the threshold of the haptic, Asiatic negritude to unmake thingifications, wilt to knowledge, deserts in the sky, breath waits. Yes, the impulse to meander or circumvent gangrenous landlords, demiurgic non-compliance, pessimism as epistemic decay. Houseplants wiggle in the draft, offering critiques in face of dust. Supervenes the regulatory board, defined as juridical flowers, resting on the succulent globe. Détourne, the object from prefatory withdrawal, a teleological suspension of the poetic, to get back at the sutured essence, take the leap into the gray, growth felt as an implosion. It was not meant to be like this. We were made to be held together. Democratic abscissions of the spectacle. To be human is to be untimely. To be post-human is to recover semblance. It may not always be the best thing going, but sometimes it is necessity that prompts us in movement. To be on the laterality, shifting the geography and its psyche of das Sein. It means to break through the sign continuum, go to the future where exchange is oxygen. To have been in spirit like barbiturated sharks in the bi-odyssey of race liberalism, put out of play, tie dialectics, we were marooned in or by submarination, compressed in nanoseconds. We risked life's implosive of the is, closing presence in the pensive, failure in the moment of articulation, lock-offed in metacritique, burdened or limited by manhood as irreplaceable, or in the mansion of absence, golden guild of legalized pocket collars, whence mystic writing pads ashore. Careless, egological sense faculties, giving little an economy or a chemistry. Thorough or rough, we went there, though we thought in the going of it, life was in and of a slant, a gap, an interstice at an impasse, quoting each other by chance. Silicet, orthogonal, rust in urban plissade mauve skein. Oh, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Wondered wherein we were of southern Kemet in search of the opening of Ka, at the moment where beyond justice seemed fated, a current of worldliness and of world loving, we the people wandered into and of the same, whereof the burlesque style. Love is the form of the global public. Reclamations exist in queerness, where we were all in a traced origin, chasing to stand apart or there apart from. To breathe is not to work. Refuge in the ing, hubbub in the roads, a repartee as the decks turn over, portable as sound, esurient for a nutritional stupefacient, i.e. the dance. No, sah. We broke away as soon as representation was afoot. Fuckery at hand, cause duppy know who to frighten. I'll probably stop there, Stephen, and see where this goes.
There you go. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a great piece. And, you know, I've read this a whole bunch of times, as I said to you just before we started, like 3 times over the past 10 days. And now you read it, just hearing it from you, again, just literally animates it in such a beautiful way. And it's an incredible piece and so rich. And, you know, so it struck me, a few things struck me about it. And I'm going to, and you know, you and I can talk forever, so I always have a bunch of questions, you know, when we talk, but then of course we never get to them because we always end up having an actual conversation. So I'll ask you about the book title in a bit, but before, again, I was reading this piece again, and rereading it now even more punctuated, like there's the affective, subjective, relational element of this, but also how it's sort of saturated in time and emotion and the tactile, right? You talk about the haptic, and I was just wondering how I had prepared this question before, but again, hearing you now speaking, I was just wondering, what do you think about these elements of your poetry that seem to take on their own life in different media, where in this piece, and the reason I put a little bit in the chat, a little of how you're writing it, it's sort of broken up and there's a lot of things going on and it's very spatially designed. So there's a very visual element to it. But if you're reading it, you don't necessarily catch that. And even you really don't catch it when you cut and paste it here. So you have that element. And I was just wondering, and I had thought about it, you know, like, what is being lost when you hear it, but now I'm also hearing what I was being gained by hearing it. So I was just wondering what you think about like reading these pieces when that visuality can't be communicated, but on the other hand, the sonorous is being communicated. I don't know if that makes.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's one of the great tensions, I think, in a lot of contemporary poetry that looks in a long tradition of experimental poetry, global experimental poetry too, because one of the things we forget is that these movements were global, or worldly is probably better, because global for me always has the kind of the added capitalism waiting to just kind of ruin the phrase. You know, I'm thinking of like N.H. Pritchard when I'm looking at like how space can really look at my, can improve how I'm using the page as like a technique, like a technology. Poetry is also, I believe, something that works read aloud. Poets were musicians and live performers historically. It may also have been the case that, you know, in some cultures around the world, particularly cultures that I am born of and into, a sense of communal orality was a huge part of narrative, storytelling, and poetry as a result of that. So there exists, I think, a useful tension for me in navigating both of them as a poet. How I'm a great believer that you should read your work aloud, but I'm also aware that for some poets, that option, the kind of public-facing oratorial poetics may not be accessible for them, and therefore turning to the page and the privacy of the page, or increasingly the screen, is something that they experiment with. And for me, I think I hold the two not in opposition to each other. I like to see how I can work together with both those, the kind of sonic, as you say, and maybe the spatial is probably how I would phrase what's going on the page. And one thing about these poems that I found really weird for me for the first time is that they came more from the spatial than they did from the oral for me. So normally, I think my practice is such that I write on the page and then I have to see how my breath gets into the language before I can kind of understand how the spatial will work for those poems. But this was the opposite direction. And that was curious to me. I still feel weird reading these poems aloud. So I'm very pleased that they will eventually be bound together in a collection and kind of gifted out outwards. But yeah, that's kind of where I sit on that.
Sorry, I'm clicking on my mute on and off. But yeah, I mean, it's funny that you said, because you didn't read some things from this piece, but you talk about the worldly, and it's interesting how you sort of want to parse that from the global, which is great, because the worldly also means the material, right? And so you were talking about the spatial. So there's like a spatial, but also a material element. And here I love this piece because you're kind of darting in and out, right, of the material. So it's funny that you said that you with this one it was more spatial, because it seems to me, and when you talk about the material, both you're talking about the corporal, right? But there's like almost like an element of the street here, right? Like the activity and the politics of the street coming in to the personal. And I think you reference elsewhere in this piece, which you didn't talk about, with Sufism, and there's a kind of an element of that, have sort of Sufist poetry or Sufi poetry kind of again commutes between the metaphysical and the physical, the metaphysical and the material, right? But of course, you're talking about the social. I was wondering, and I don't want to be like also culturally deterministic, right? Because it sounds so freaking corny. I think, especially with Sufism, people have hammered it.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that maybe what these poems brought out of me was, which is probably a better way of phrasing it, is that, okay, so there's a couple of things going on for me when I'm thinking about Agassiz. So, you were going to ask this question about the title, so let me take it off your hand. So the title is, I found it in Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, when he's quoting some white supremacist, like French sociologist, who's basically saying that, the white working class can't be kept in a gastelum with the blacks, the Asians, the et cetera, the colonized and oppressed people of the world. And agastelum was this weird Latin sounding word. And I was like, whoa, what am I going to, it's triggering something in me. So I looked it up, I looked into its history, and, it's basically a dungeon where the Romans would have kept slaves. And particularly, this was in the dictionary, particularly rebellious slaves. So this was this idea that to be of that kind of particularity, to be rebellious, meant that you ended up in this space, this agastelum, this dungeon. And it seems to me that the world over, this is now what we are confronting. But so there are various kind of uprisings happening, simmering under the surface, whether I'm looking at BLM and the movements that have come from that, or whether I'm looking in the UK and the kind of revolt against the Tory regime. There's various social movements against austerity here, whether I'm looking in Colombia, in Palestine, et cetera, right? The list kind of proliferates. And of course, in Kashmir, which is ongoing resistance. So what is bringing the energy of these movements together is, I think, something that Byung-Chul Han has touched on. So he's a Korean, German kind of cultural theorist. I mean, he's a great philosopher. And I think one of the most prescient voices of philosophy for the 21st century. And Byung-Chul Han is particularly interested in like neoliberal biopolitics and how that's manifesting in this kind of technocratic age where all of us are plugged into some sort of machine. And Byung-Chul Han basically says what we have lost is duration. So we have lost the ability to feel a moment on a very well registered internal level. The kind of evisceration of duration means that our life is increasingly a series of tasks. So we're constantly moving from point A to B, and we're just shuttling along like this. We don't really have a sense of actual internal time and rhythm. This may be, for example, why dance music is such a thing, like electronically produced dance music. So not EDM, but I'm thinking particularly of like house or jungle or dub, these kind of things, is because there's a regulated rhythm with a lot of those types of music. And the bass line, which is this kind of sinuous energy, is there to sort of to bind us in the different valences of what a duration might be for each beat or each break. And that's just kind of off the top that I'm thinking, like, how does music, how does insurgency give us a sense of duration back? And what I wanted my poems to do, or what these poems ended up speaking to me as being part and parcel of, was this reclamation of duration, that we need to take back our time. And one of the ways in which poetry can do that is by, and I think the Franco Bifo Berardi is arguably the most eminent theorist of this. Bifo has talked about financial capitalism as the almost a ruination of language. Language itself has become so limited. So on the one hand, time has stopped becoming an internal individual somatic experience, which is duration. And on the other hand, language is becoming clipped and, sheared down to the bare minimal of, like, emojis and how we react on social media. Like, the conversation has died a long death. But it's been very sudden for us to realize the necessity to have extended long form conversation. So what Bifo posits, that poetic language is a way of stretching out financial language again to reclaim our language. And I'm doing, obviously, classically, like more Italian hand gestures than I need to be right now, trying to explain that. But that's where I'm at with that. And I was thinking about these two theorists a lot, and their influence on my thinking, and just normal behaviors in the day. And obviously that's gonna leak into the poem. But all of that for me, that the affective, the social, these almost like this is like basic critical theory stuff for me. Affect theory is like so ubiquitous now. Everything is a damn affect. But it's like, how do you kind of materialize that in your poems? And that's hence the like messed up form, the irregularity, the grammatology of it, using a lot of punctuation in totally, bad grammar ways, is for me a way of trying to, reassert the poetic time, the time of the lyric, back into a world where it seems to have gone.
It's funny you said, so you touched on something I will talk about later on. I wanted to ask you later on about narco-poetics, actually, about that sort of element of, so there's like going to be a loop here, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. But you're talking about duration, and of course, we all know that, time has been commodified, right? And that's kind of what you're saying. And the neoliberal post-industrial era, it's just a matter of further parsing moments of time into commodified segments, right? So I had asked you a month ago, what does ergastina mean? So I went and actually myself did some work and on it, and it's actually a Greek word, and they really don't necessarily know where the etymology is from. But one of the potential origins also is workspace, right? So it's the workspace that you keep the slaves, and you, as you said, some of them being the rebellious slaves, but so it's also sort of the workspace for the slave, right? And there's kind of, and that's when you're explaining, what you're explaining seems to be very clear in the piece, because it's sort of a reclamation, of the slave, of the time, and the means of production, which is your poetry. And I think your poetry is very much always about poetry as well. Like there's a meta level always, right? It's always very much there, which is like I'm not throwing shade on other people. Sometimes people like are doing poetry and it just becomes a medium for a message, which is cool too. But just there's a very sort of, this is also what I meant also by the Sufi element, right? There's really a commutation, a commuting between these different levels of metaphysics, physics, materialism, immaterialism, ontology,
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying that. And thank you for also bringing my attention to the potential Greek etymology of agastum. I mean, I'm grateful to know all these meanings, because I think one of the things that these poems taught me was to try and let go of this idea of mastery or control over the lyric. The lyric is something that works through me, but I don't necessarily have control over the time of it or its kind of materiality. And that can be really unsettling. The idea that sometimes you're entering a language without necessarily really knowing the precise and concrete meaning in that language. You're just in it, And that does bring me back to Sufism, because Sufism has played a huge part in my life. And I've been really sad to see the commodification of Sufi thinking.
Rumi is not talking to your girlfriend?
Yeah. Well, it's also the fact that, there's a long history of collaboration actually between, I mean, look, Whitman, arguably, Walt Whitman, this great American poet, right, who, is taught all the time. The reason I liked Whitman is because I found out that he was reading German translations of Sufi poets. And that kind of informed some, not all, but some of, what he was doing and thinking. Like American transcendentalism is kind of, Sufism light in a way. Yeah. So.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. I know this is a
Go on.
bit of element that you might. Do you know your favorite person, Ezra Pound? Do you know his son's name? His son's name?
Don't say it's Rumi.
It's Omar.
Oh wow.
From Omar Khayyam.
No way. See, this is what I mean, is there's a long history of this kind of collaboration. And what's actually happening in this kind of like, Bikram yoga era of poetry is that the true, or the kind of concrete material cultural signatures of Rumi's poetry have been deracinated by what are called renderings, right? So they often work, these so-called translators are sometimes working from actually just old English translations, then they're just kind of modernizing them. So it's very difficult. And I know that there is a huge effort, and this is what Moscow said, is that there's a huge effort on the part of Persian speakers and Arabic language speakers to do some reparative action about this state of affairs, which is definitely has quite a dominating position in the global literary marketplace. But I have learned a lot from Sufism in terms of the fact that it was arguably the first kind of hermeneutic movement within Islam, right? Like a lot of these Sufis back in the sort of, God knows, like 10th and 11th century, what they were really arguing for was for interpretation of Islam and the Sharia through poetry, through culture, but also to realign an old set of laws and regulations with the times in which that they found themselves as practitioners of it. Obviously, this was going to get shunned by the more pious elements in the Muslim community, but that's what Sufism represented for me. It was a literary movement. It was a question of hermeneutics, of interpretation. So I've always thought about that Sufi poetry had this meta element it was always poems about the interpretation of Islam. So I've grown up thinking of that and listening to my maternal grandfather read in Farsi or try in Urdu and in Arabic to read these poems, and I had books in the original Farsi or original Arabic in my house, and I can look at them and appreciate the calligraphy, but I can't, the meaning can't. I'm not either of those languages. I'm not competent in either of them. So there was an element where I knew of this interpretive kind of battle in these poems, and I've always thought that it's important. I think not that your poetry not only address a reader, but addresses itself as a construction and point out its artifice. Because it would be terrible if it was to conflate my personhood with the poetry. I think that we should be long gone of this, but there seems to be a resurgence of biographical interpretations of works. So, and it's something I'm keen to distance myself from, essentially.
Well, two things, and we want to get on to this next piece, speaking about the meta and the unconscious. You have Sufi also, so you have this tradition within your cultural unconscious, is what I say. It seeps into you, into your sort of DNA unconsciously. And also, it's funny that the translations, for someone who's an Arabist, I very much disappreciate, unappreciate, and deride all these folks who love to publish, based on 19th century rewriting translations, which are always shitty to begin with. But the concept of rendering, it's like rendering fat to me. It's like getting a freaking animal and like boiling it down into this fucking piece of soap. There you go.
It's a reduction. It's a reduction.
It is. I mean, like, you boil it down, put it into soap, put it in the fucking Hallmark store, and there's your Sufi poetry. So let's move on to this next piece, which is from your other forthcoming book, Boiled Owl. So it's a bit of a shift. So
this is now where I'm a contrarian and I go into the autobiographical, right? Even though I'm trying to distance myself.
Well, the autobiographical and subjective are there's an interplay. One is determinative and one's a source, right?
So let me get into it and get this up. So Boiled Owls is a collection of poetry, theory, and prose, and it's about substance abuse and recovery from substance abuse. And this is the opening poem in the collection, which is called High Modernist Relapse. In the land of neurochemistry, everyone is equally fucked. A physical material self walks through the high grass in search of new neural pathways. Some of them have shorter stems growing over the previously trodden on versions of such paths, but they now start to blend into the tall flowers. I like the idea of walking in recovery. Sometimes you make machetes from your soles and chop through the foliage to feel your way through. Other times you follow someone else's clearing, but those old paths are predestined and you know where you'll end up. Sometimes it's best to push through the nettle burn and sit down on the other side. But there are moments when we're vulnerable, hubristic and hysterical, unthinking and unfeeling, repressing something ulterior in the sinuses of solipsistic stories. I often get anxious saying these things. How can I write a poem about how I recovered from drug addiction without a strong I in there? I can't absent myself from a story about myself. I tried to imagine the high grass that day when I followed an old path, hoping for a new end point. I made an old choice, hoping for a new result. I went to a pub called The Junction. The Junction is pugnacious and habeas viscus vibrates slowly over the rooftops. I'm informed at the entrance there is decreased D2 receptor availability. I frown without really understanding what that means. The Junction is the place where you can hear a culture of quivering between history and ontology. The corporeal realm is littered with glass over amen breaks. The advert in the window asks me if I want a career in leisure. The reward is deficiency, the recruitment suboptimal. Sure, I think. Pay me to drink Stella in the sunshine or to snort enough white so that I don't have to share air with fascists. The junction is full of addicts, junkies, crackheads, daytime binge drinkers performing mnemonic labor over the slot machines, trying to figure out if the phantoms are imaginary or not. I swallow rat poison. We're all drinking so much alcohol, I'm not sure what we're preserving. This beautiful escape from planetary death. The pub is also full of plant sellers outside doing tricep dips on the rickety benches before stroking the filthy pugs at passers-by. I started to feel hungry. The bartender tells me that the stomach is always already empty. I smile, and he goes back to reading Heidegger whilst counting the change in the till. No one really planned on ending up here, playing pool with strangers, wearing our St. George's crosses, going to crusade with the voices in our heads. The Palestinian equestrian chases the dragon on the lawn. I see a new pale ale called Delirium Tremens. The pink elephant comes alive and fucks me. I give birth stillborn on the hippocampus. It turns out maybe there isn't a cure for this, I say to the damaged diachronic agent. I should know. I've waited a whole year, expecting myself to heal and get better, and I did in part, but one sip of beer is 5 pints is 2 grams of yay. The agent peels an orange. Its two halves are anisotropic, he says, fractional like your pleasure centers. The agent is obsessed with aphorisms. He turns to me and says, what is organic is corruptible. It's okay to be off your face so many hours in the day. What is a face? What is being off it? I cast my eyes to the heavens, praying for an exit from the conversation. The agent keeps saying I have an air of interrogate dejection about me. I misheard and said, I don't inject. He says, the truth occupies every singularity. He pulls out Flaubert's Madame Bovary and, looking suggestively over the spine, he offers me a wink and continues, mimetic poisons are the best sedatives or cures you'll find. If you want to fit in here, it's probably worth knowing how to talk. Such agents, however damaged or diachronic, are the subject's entrance into self-narration. It's an automatic impulse to say. In order to eat from the broken orange, you have to pass an exam on Emmanuel Levinas by shouting the words say and responsibility for an entire hour with increasing intensity and volume. No one knows why this is a test. The agents always mutter something about fractal interiorities and algebras of need, full immersion in the relapse recovery process. I begin to think this is all an elaborate ruse to negotiate a temporality that fishes over our recondite fantasies. I begin to wish for an indecent end to all of this. Sometimes the agent switches into the subjunctive mood to get a point across. That's why you throw shrapnel at my knuckles. At the bottom of this well, there are wishes, and the damaged agent wished me well before telling me I should get this right now, otherwise I might end up like him, peeling an orange at the junction at the age of 70, with veins lined with metallic adulteration, wishing I had more time. The agents are libidinally invested in these subjunctive moods. It's as if the totality of care provided at the junction wasn't enough to provide comfort. Away with dog fairies, asleep in psychosis, comatose alertness. The relapse is not meant to be part of this journey, but it's now part of mine. Friends who love me, call me and express sorrow. This isn't for them to apologize. It's for my lips to crack over, pale gray in their silence. The palimpsests of joy confound a sober version of myself. I am never authentic and battle the construction of two false selves. Each self is authenticity sous rature. The more false they are, the more true they are. I've fallen under the spell of the high priest of recidivism, the new avant-garde founded on a voxel-based morphometric that saps at my resources. The narrative suffers structural alterations. I become hypersensitive, mourning for the lack of protein molecule no-go-A. I volunteered for victimhood in the mesocorticolimbic system. The administrator tells me to start forgetting things I used to remember in the morning. The administrator also warns me that my failure to do this would result in a lifelong illness such as was suffered by a patient who, upon entering the junction, recited Whitman's 1 hour to madness and joy for a whole day, and ended up cutting out his tongue. In recovery, they tell you to keep it in the day for a reason. In relapse, the day removes your means of articulation, stuck and without flexion. Okay, take another hit and then lie here, the administrator orders. And then I'm laid down on a bed of rocks and covered in price tags. After an hour, I have to walk around the pub wearing nothing but the price tags, which are affixed to my body. If this doesn't work, I have to go and scream at myself in the mirror. If that doesn't work, I'll be electrocuted. In the state of powerlessness, there might come a surrender to the process of quailing at shortcomings, reticent but fully exposed to the tides of thought that break across my brow with a new tortured disconsolation. The fear that arches above a purple aura as sun sets on cheer like a disconnected phone call. I reverberate with the clouds, those tiny esoteric sacks of tears from the sky. You move over my skin like a mosquito, and maybe it happens again, the relapse, maybe it doesn't, but the desire to find a lesson in this is quite hard to catch in my hands, and I'm reaching for some kind of comfort in the cortex of someone else who knows this affliction. Hypertrophic, obstinate abstinence implements the stringency of familiar wisdom. You don't sit in a barbershop not expecting to get a haircut. Why would you sit in a pub not expecting to drink? Modest behavioral differences are swept under activated astrocytes. The gibbous moon leaves oleaginous spots on my skin, a diffusion of sensibility paramount to microgliosis. They take my blood. The test results come back positive and displays increased volume. I'm not really sure what I wanted the test to come back as. I contemplate leaving the junction. The bartender looks over at me sternly and orders me a drink. I force a line into me, wondering, what is this way that separates us? I'm now outside. I'm smoking. I feel on fire. I'm back in the high grass, searching. All the leaves in my body are shaking.
Thank you so much for that. That's just so, I mean, it's so incredible, so incredibly powerful and honest. I love this line, you know, hypertrophic obstinate abstinence implements the stringency of familiar wisdom. So you have this like wonderful line, so complex and sophisticated, but then it just breaks down to, you know, you don't sit in a barbershop and not expecting to get a haircut. You know, I love this piece, and it's, again, so brilliant. The craftsmanship or craftspersonship is fantastic, and it's so intensely personal, but it's also kind of bigger. It's bigger than you, and it's bigger. It's to some degree. It's not. It's. I don't want to move away from addiction and make it a metaphor, right? Because in this piece, it is really, it's very much about that. And I love this sort of tension between two selves and multiple selves, and you have this demiurgic agent and you have this disciplinary administrators, right? But I'm suspecting that the junction is not only a pub. So maybe could you like pull out sort of, you know, because there's so much coming together, and like the junction is like a nodal, not to get all fucking Lacanian or anything like that, right? But like, right? So maybe you can sort of flesh this out of this sort of physical, metaphysical, metaphorical space of the
I mean, okay, so Boiled Owls is the title of the collection, and Narco-Poetics is its subtitle. And Narco-Poetics, which is a piece that unfortunately you're just going to have to wait until the book's out before it's out in the world. But essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work out a poetics of not just abuse of drugs and recovery from drugs, but also like an aesthetic representation of those processes, which I think are really important, because I think that Deleuze and Guattari are wrong in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, where they basically say that like schizophrenia and capitalism are these two kind of like, you know, like schizophrenia is the disease of capitalism. It's like incarnate, and it works in their theory, right? But actually, if I was speaking from what I've witnessed, I think in the 21st century, we're looking at addiction as the epidemic that's going to really ravage the world, and especially the youth of the world. And okay, so if you want to get over addiction, there are several things that you have to bear in mind. So the first thing is that the most successful way of dealing with this is to do a 12-step program. And that's not to say that there aren't problems with a 12-step program, but it's to say that all this other weird kind of like fake communist psychoanalysis that suggests that abstinence isn't revolutionary and that some people might not be cut out for abstinence just flies in the face of the reality that the amount of studies that have been done on this and the changes in the brain. So that's why there's a lot of this kind of sciencey language in those poems, which people can look up if they want. They're very boring articles that I took them from. They're like neuroscience articles about different pathways in the brain that are essentially like, you know, shot through when the brain becomes an addicted brain. And the brain may not fully recover from addiction. It's actually a management strategy for your behavior. The 12 steps was developed, well, it was actually Carl Jung is in the big book of AA, right? So like there's a lot about early psychoanalysis that I think we can take. And Carl Jung essentially says to like this alcoholic, like, I know what you need, but I don't know how to give it to you. You need a total psychic rearrangement. So it's like a total rearrangement of your thought process. It's painful, it's difficult to go through. It's taken, this is my second attempt now that I'm doing it. And, you know, long may this continue, but it is difficult, you know, to change your entire orientation of your behavior in your life. And that's what that poem is trying to think through. It's like, okay, you're kind of at this juncture where it is going to get progressively difficult for you if you continue in one way, you know, the road forwards. But then it's also a pretty hard journey the other way. And I wanted the poem to sort of embed that process within this idea of a narrative text. Hence, there's a lot of this meta language about the narrative suffering structural alterations, the whole idea of the agent being a diachronic agent and falling into a subjunctive mood, and using the language of language, like a kind of meta language, to describe the writing of this poetics. And that's why it had to begin with a relapse as well, is because I needed to create this loop. It's a difficult, knotty process, and there isn't really one way to go around it. But from my experience and the experience of many people in 12-step fellowships, there is a solution that is on offer. And I wanted that to be in there somehow, the madness and difficulty of it.
You know, I love this piece, and I wanted to flesh it out more with you a bit. But what I'm going to do is, first thing I want to do is just note, and I think we've had talked about this in the past. Not all revolutionaries are, you know, don't think that sobriety is a revolutionary act. There's a really good book by, gosh, I forget the name. Oh, is it? I think it's an anarchist collective. It's called Sobriety Living for the Revolution. So I just put I put the link here in the chat. But rather than me go on, I think maybe if we only have a little time, maybe you could do narco poetics as a sort of way for me to ask you the next round of the questions about what you had just read.
Yeah, I can do that. No worries. Let me find it. Okay. I'm unmuted. Yeah.
It's brief enough. We can fit it, I think.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Narco poetics. Wow, this is the first time I'm reading this aloud. This is crazy. Okay.
Fantastic. Am I putting you in a bad? I don't want to put you in a bad way.
I want to before I read this, and I'm going to read one last thing at the end actually too. I want to remember a dear poet who's passed away in the last couple of days, Callie Gardner. Callie was a really fierce activist, a great intellectual, and one of the greatest poets. Well, they would hate me saying this, but they were one of the greatest poets I've been, you know, I've had the privilege of meeting. Callie was instrumental in their book, Naturally It Is Not, which the 87 Press had the great privilege of publishing, in helping me think through what anarcho-poetics might be. So this is for Kali, and I'm going to end the narco-poetics with a reading of Kali's very short editorial from 2020. Okay, narco-poetics. I want to put the concept and its signifier to work. I want to perform labor to communicate, to express, to interpret. Narco-poetics is both the poetics of drug use and its aesthetic representation. It conceptualizes the fact that writing and reading are addictive, are eminent narcotics, the imagination, thought, etc. Art itself carries an enormous healing potential outside of the rubric of neoliberal wellness capitalism, outside of new age spiritual bromides. It is a fact of life that reading and writing can heal or offer a space to heal. It is integral for addicts in recovery to begin their journey with a new way of life. That is the nature of all 12-step programs, which rely exclusively on the direction of a single text. The new way of life is also a new way of knowing, of reading, of saying. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is full of direction, promise, spirit, but it also teaches an addict how to read, how to live a way of life that is designed by others for others. And the transmission of this design is through literature, through the inherent reaching out that language does, a reaching towards meaning, cemented in the daily living of life, a way to rearrange life, to live and to not simply exist. To read is a radical act. Narco-poetics is the radical expression of recovery from drug use, which begins from the addict who learns to narrate their own story, to follow a life that is designed on the page, a life that is full of meaning and acceptance and the courage to change. But our reading only begins with the big book, just like our recovery only begins with stopping substance abuse. Recovery is labor. Narco-poetics is the creative expression of labor as labor force. Addiction is the death drive in capitalism, the incessant desire for growth, for consumption, for never running out of the substance which is capital. It is therefore the addict in recovery who embodies and lives the life that we need as an example for the overthrow of capital in the glorious revolution to come. Marxism is a critique of the political economy that creates addiction as its manifestation. The addict in recovery is a potential revolutionary subject. Recovery from addiction can mean recovery from capitalism if the right thoughts are aligned, if the right connection is made with a higher power or a purpose which entails living altruistically and not avariciously. It is about commonwealth, common spaces, common goals, rather than the incessant retreat into the self-centeredness of private ownership. Recovery is proof that an alternative to capitalism exists and can be used to change the base and superstructure of the global political economy. And finally, this incredible editorial by the late Kali Gardner. Many people have commented on a noted poet's statement last year, poems are rarely on the side of power, but we find ourselves somewhere where we must know that the reverse is true. It's a rare poem, in fact, that can not only imagine a world that grows differently from its very roots, but speaks as though it is already in existence. If you let it, poetry can be the resilient technology of love and liberation, but it's not inherently good. So we should be vigilant about what the world is asking our poems to be and do the opposite. If they ask you to be simple, be difficult. If they tell you to be articulate, don't bend or explain. If they want you only as a soothing voice into the evening, screech shatteringly into the still morning. You're muted.
I think you also had one of these pieces, the issue of refusal, that this kind of, it's speaking to one of these pieces that I had read. Rather than me say anything, I welcome you to leave us with some last words. Otherwise, I can just want to thank you for your revolutionary practice in writing, which that talks about.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Maybe I'll end with like a little piece of of advice for poets in this audience. This feels very strange because I cannot see anyone. I'm just Stephen, and I'm speaking into this void, which is really
There are
weird.
thousands out there that wait on our bated breath.
I'm really, you know, if there are thousands, then God bless.
Throngs.
Even if there are tens, God bless you all. But still, you know, I guess one of the things that poets get asked all the time is, you know, like a bit about your creative practice, or I think Callie's editorial really sums it up when they said, you know, if they ask you to be simple, be difficult. I have this thing about, you know, the obstinate abstinence, yeah, and being obstinate is and being obstreperous, being really loud, is great. And I think that poetry has always been part of revolutions, and that we can't lose hope that there will be change in this world. We need this change now. You know, it might seem really futile to write a poem in the face of the global capitalist machine and planetary death and all the fucking COVID-19 pandemic, but it is important, and it's important if you make the writing and reading of those poems part of a community and collective practice. So remember that you don't write alone and that you don't have meaning alone. But if you want to really do poetry, you have to understand the study of poetry. And so my advice would be to read long poems. Read poets who've got not just good standing, but maybe people who don't have good standing, like J.H. Prynne, who's fallen out of fashion in the UK, or you're looking at Nathaniel Mackie's serialized poems, and especially the new collection, Double Trio from New Directions. These are some living and some, and there are also great dead poets out there who we should all be reading. But read widely and don't be afraid of the lyric. It's a difficult to wield technology, but it's with you if you write it. So that's my advice, is to do things collectively and read some stuff that's really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, number one, brown, loud, proud, and unmanageable.
Yeah.
And I think you're awesome. You do all that. That's all you, man. And your work is, you know, I want to say your work is a weapon, but it's also more than that, right? It's just really beautiful and operates on so many different levels. So I think your work is exemplary to me, who is really just amateur in the realm of poetry. But I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you all for being here, for supporting 1455, to check out Azad's work. And we shall see you and hope you enjoy a good rest of the festival.